A Ukrainian long-range drone flies deep inside of Russia. Within minutes, the Lukoil Volgograd facility, producing about 5% of Russia's refined oil, is burning. It is the 16th major refinery hit in just the past few months. But the question isn't just how the drones get through. The question is why Russia's $350 billion security state cannot stop them. And the answer is not in the skies over Volgograd. The answer is in the quiet, vicious civil war currently raging inside of Moscow. Because while Russia's refineries burn, its security services are devouring themselves. Generals are being arrested, entire departments are being purged, and this new war for cash, for control of the shadow economy, and for survival is heating up. Today, this internal war has exposed the homeland. Today, they are exploiting a system that is actively and cannibalistically destroying Russia's elite. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post and a national security advisor. The fact is that the fires over the Volga are a symptom. The actual disease is in the civil war at the FSB. The FSB is Russia's security service. It is the successor of the KGB. But today, it is locked in a very dangerous war over who will get the limited assets that are left. Historically, it's important to understand that all of Russia's elites made their money from stealing resources from the state, from stealing from the public what would have otherwise gone to help them. If you look at any of the major companies or any of the richest people in Russia, they have something in common. They made their money in the 1990s when things were privatized. Taking advantage of these privatized schemes, they were able to take over major parts of the nation's infrastructure. They would typically buy these things for pennies or via corruption. And as a result, they became incredibly wealthy. But the state of Russia became incredibly poor. But the second class of these people, those from the FSB, those from the KGB, they were there to provide protection, to make sure that these different clans gave them their cut as well. So they would typically shake down these large businesses, create rackets, and find other ways of enriching themselves. But today, the crisis that's been created by Ukrainian drone strikes has broken the elite's non-aggression pact. That is the unspoken agreement going back to the 1990s that we see today embodied in Vladimir Putin to make sure that they would not cut into each other's revenue flows. They make sure that they are not allies, not friends, but at least not going at it with each other. Vladimir Putin had always been the arbitrator. He's the one who's above all this, who makes sure there's a balance of power. Make sure that there's no war in Moscow. The 1990s in Russia were very, very dangerous. It was very bloody in Moscow. But that stopped because Putin put order to things. He wouldn't allow these factions to fight. But now, suddenly, there is not enough to steal to satisfy all the competing Siloviki, all of the competing business factions. And today, the clans have turned inward to strip assets from each other rather than from the state or the public. Today, the balance of fear is spreading. So today, this desperation for money, for assets, has caused the regime to have a new problem, one that's causing it to lose this war in Ukraine. And this is one more factor that is rarely touched on the Western press. It's how Moscow actually operates. How often do you hear about Putin? How often does it sound like he's a strongman that has total control of his country? And yet, very few people even understand how the top class in Russia operates. So the next few minutes, we will cover that. And you'll see why Russia is doomed. So let's dive into this, exactly why it is that the elites in Russia are going at it. We have to understand that this desperation for money fundamentally has altered how the regime profited from its primary export, oil. Sanctions did not stop the oil money. They simply redirected it into deep shadows. So today it's hidden from the public, but it's still there. We know about the shadow fleets. But that's why there's a new war economy that's emerged around the roughly 350 aging, uninsured tankers known as the Shadow Fleet. The Shadow Fleet became the critical infrastructure for the entire gray budget of Russia. Today, all the dark money is connected somehow to those sanctioned tankers, which incredibly enough, the West could stop if it wished to. We know where they are all located. we could easily interdict them. We could board those ships, but we choose not to. But either way, I could digress. Think of sanctions as being like a dam built across a great river of money. The dam did not stop the river, but it forces the water into new, hidden, and treacherous channels. These channels are the Shadow Fleet, and these new channels are small, and the river of cash is huge. So the clans today are fighting not over the whole river, but specifically who will control these new narrow choke points. And this is why this war has become so vicious. We see that they are attacking each other publicly, that they're leaking information about each other publicly because they are trying to discredit each other. They're trying to lock up each other. And the most interesting part about this is that this infighting, it inevitably spread from the commercial world to the state's security apparatus. In fact, today we see that the FSB, the GRU, which is military intelligence, the FSO, which are the secret service of Russia, they're fighting for these different flows of cash as well. But the FSB split into rival factions, and now it's fighting for control of the customs, control of the ports, control of the Shadow Fleet routes. And this is all very chaotic. Now, historically, Putin, one of the things he did was that he put order in this. He didn't want to see this sort of chaos in Russia. He didn't want it to be like the lawless 1990s. But today, the first group, it's headed by a guy named Igor Sechin. He's from Rosneft. He's the ex-KGB oil boss, and his group of guys, called the Hammers, are known for coercive power. They're known for the use of violence, the use of truly the most horrible ways of convincing somebody to do something. That's the way they would typically go about it. If you think of the stereotype of how the Russian mafia would behave, that's them. But then there's another group of people, and they're called the bankers or the accountants, but they're led by Yuri Kovalchuk. Now, Yuri is in charge of Banco Rossiya. He's Putin's personal banker, but more than that, he has a different approach to how you take state assets, how you enrich yourself. His people are softer, still illegal, still criminals, but softer. They like to use things like court orders, tax audits, legal seizures of assets. Now, Putin historically had the role of being the one who was the arbiter between these two different factions, making sure that though there were scarce resources, they would be able to cooperate. But today, there's too scarce of resources, and now they're just trying to get rid of each other. Now they're trying to destroy each other. But one of the things that's interesting is to understand the methods that they use, the tactics that they use. So there are different agencies of the government. For instance, economic security or military counterintelligence, internal security, which is interesting. Department M, internal security, that are the spies from the FSB put into other government offices, like the prosecutor's office, the police offices. They are there to just spy for them. Now, in the Soviet period, that was probably to assure that there would be no foreign intelligence or things like this. But today, it's just making sure that they are aware of all the money going through it so they could take part of it or take all of it. The person who's in charge of this entire operation is a guy named Ivan Tekachev, who's known as the Enforcer. As you can imagine from a guy called the Enforcer, who heads up a Russian mafia, he seems like a very scary man. But there's something that's interesting about him, is that he has been doing his best to make sure to get rid of his opponents. And his opponents included people like Shoigu, Gerasimov. Now, Shoigu was replaced last year, and Gerasimov looks like he's on the way out. Their deputies have ended up in handcuffs. But all this was because they are fighting for the vast resources of the military, fighting for money that they realize could be in their pockets, not the military's. The military has been totally sidelined in this war. At the same time, we see something else going on. We see that the accountants, this other bloc, is fighting for the resources they can get. They're using the General Prosecutor's Office, which has become today Russia's most feared corporate raider. But there's something fascinating of how they're doing that, which you probably didn't know about. In 2024, a court abolished the statute of limitations on the 1990s privatization deals within Russia. That is a legal atomic bomb that helped this faction to gain a lot of assets. So what that means? Well, in real terms, give an example of the sort of things that are privatized that the state just took back. Domodedovo Airport in Moscow, one of the largest in Russia, the second largest in Moscow. Well, guess what? It was taken back by the government. What's incredible is in just the past couple of years, they've taken about $50 billion of assets away from private companies and decided it was now the state's. Now, of course, the objective here is not to enrich the state. It's not to give the state more tax base. The objective is very simple. And the objective is simply to give more money to this accountant's branch. But there's something that happened recently that has changed the civil war, that has forever allowed one side to have a major advantage. And that's what we are seeing just in the past couple of months. And it's a very big deal. But this also explains a lot of problems that we see in the military today relate to this. Back on September 11th, 2025, Ivan Takachev was promoted to lead military counterintelligence. This means that the Hammer's top enforcer, he is directly inside of the Ministry of Defense. Today, he has the power to arrest generals. He has the power to control their wartime contracts. He has got all the power he needs to use fear, which has replaced merit in the Russian military, to demand what he wants. So let's imagine that you need to have more shells. Does he care about the outcome of this war, or does he care about making money? It's definitely the latter. He needs to bring back money for his clan. So when you come to him with the document he signed, he looks at this and says, and where's my percentage of this? This has allowed the corruption in the military, the further hamstring in the military. And it's, as you know, they've arrested a lot of generals and things. 15 out of 17 generals arrested were from the logistics or from acquisitions. But none of them were arrested for corruption. And of course, it was formally the reason in all the cases. But it's so that other people could engage in the corruption now instead of them. That's what this has always been about. It's always what it's going to be about with the Russians. But today we see that this is slowing things down across the country. Because let's imagine that there is a Russian general in Ukraine who desperately needs shells, and he's waiting for that officer back in Moscow to have the document signed. That document is not going to get signed. Because that officer back in Moscow, that colonel, is looking at this and thinking, my predecessor is now in jail for cutting deals. Do I want to cut a deal? Does this really help me? It doesn't. And all of this is going to make it harder for the Russians to continue fighting this war. But there's something else going on that's created quite a panic with these elites, with this inner working circle in Moscow. On the 11th of September, 2025, Viktor Zolotov, head of the National Guard of Russia, Rosgvardia, one of Putin's closest friends, he had been Putin's bodyguard for many years, announced the reactivation of tank units. What's interesting about that is the tank units are not going to be sent to Ukraine, and they're not there to defend against the West. They are going to be assigned to Moscow. Now, the reason he gave publicly was to counter terrorism. But the fact is, the National Guard, its primary job is to prevent protest. So why do they need tanks? Tanks are used when deal with other armored units. Well, it's for a very simple reason. The regime doesn't fear public protest. It fears its own enforcers. It fears a move by the FSB, the army, or Prigozhin's successors to seize power. It wants to have its own loyal tank units in Moscow to protect the Kremlin. Today, this internal fracture, though, is magnifying the effects of every external attack by Ukraine. So Ukraine today, these attacks that it carries out inside of Russia, yes, they're hurting Russia's ability to wage war by taking away the revenues that would come from oil. But there's something else. It's intensifying greatly the infighting in Russia. The Kremlin's projects today are becoming slowed down by this. They're becoming impossible to operate, but it won't change. And the reason is very simple. Today, we see across Russia, this is spreading. We see it mirrored in the regions. Governors now signal that this decay has spread to them as well. They're no longer collecting taxes for the center, for Moscow. They've become more like feudal barons protecting their own local turfs. And so when we look at the situation in Russia, when refineries in their regions burn, they beg Moscow for aid that is slow to come, and it's oftentimes never to arrive because the clans in Moscow realize there's limited assets. And making money today, money that should go to repairs but they could instead put in their pockets, is obviously going to be the most high priority for anyone in Russia. That is their objective, their own self-enrichment. What's good for the state, not the long-term objectives of the state. What is good for me today? But that is exactly where we have a problem. Vladimir Putin thinks exactly the same way. He knows it's not sustainable. He knows this is bad. But right now, he can't handle all the problems at one time. His rival factions, he's always kept them happy by feeding them money, by giving them easy money to steal. But today, he can't do that. He can't guarantee them that. He can't guarantee that they all will receive the same amount. And that's why today, he himself knows that he is in a challenging situation. He's in a situation where his regime could truly be destabilized. Vladimir Putin has no reasonable reason to believe that his regime can continue. And for those who think that he does, that he thinks that he's stable, he thinks that his situation under control, look at his recent public behavior. He's behaving as somebody who is not so sure of what is to come. He behaves as someone who's very concerned about what the future holds. So we look at things going on that are inexplicable to everybody else, like the war in Ukraine. Why would he want to continue this war in Ukraine? It appears that the United States was willing to give him a great deal. President Trump had offered a large amount of what he'd wanted. So why didn't he go for it? Why didn't he take the once-in-a-lifetime deal? Well, consider that perhaps this is not about Ukraine, because this war has never been about Ukraine. This war is being done for reasons that Moscow has, not because of Ukraine. And today, the reason that it continues is Vladimir Putin must do his own calculations of what will balance power. And today, there is a military that's very unhappy, a military that's been destroyed with over 1,100,000 soldiers killed or injured due to Vladimir Putin. And due to people like those from the FSB, those from Rosneft, that are hamstringing the military in order to increase their own profits. And as a result of that, the fact that they're killing their own citizens to make more money, why do you think they don't want to see the military come back to Moscow? They don't want to see a bunch of young, armed, and very unhappy men that are filled with violence coming back to visit them in the streets of the capital. They understand very well how dangerous that could be for them. So when Vladimir Putin does things that are hard to understand, that for us seem totally wild, like not negotiating an end to this war, you must understand why. The reason is very simple. It has nothing to do with Ukraine. Has this ever had to do with Ukraine? This has always been due to reasons that the Kremlin understands, and due to the politics of the Kremlin, which unfortunately, virtually nobody in the West understands or talks about, and which almost never is in the press. Thank you for watching.